there are voices that should never be silenced. In the autumn of 1873, residents of a small township near the Hudson River Valley began noticing something peculiar. The grand estate of Baron Heinrich von Strauss, a wealthy Austrian immigrant who had purchased the old Vanner mansion 3 years prior, had become eerily quiet. No more evening gatherings. No more carriages arriving for elaborate dinners. The servants who once gossiped freely at the local market now hurried through their errands in silence, their eyes downcast. But it was the music, or rather the absence of it, that truly disturbed those who remembered. The Baron had been known throughout the region for his obsession with opera, hosting performances that drew audiences from as far as New York City. Then, without explanation, the music stopped. Or rather, it didn't stop. It simply vanished behind the mansion's thick stone walls, where only the Baron could hear the voice that had once captivated hundreds. What happened within those walls would not be discovered until a brutal winter storm in 1876 forced open secrets that powerful men had worked desperately to keep buried. Before we continue with the story of Baron von Strauss and the woman whose voice became both her gift and her prison, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And tell us in the comments what state are you listening from. Now, let's uncover what really happened in that mansion on the Hudson. The township of Rincliffe, New York in 1873 was a place caught between two worlds. The old Dutch families who had settled the region 2 centuries earlier still maintained their stone houses and their quiet Presbyterian ways. But the new money, railroad baronses, steel magnates, European nobility fleeing political upheaval was transforming the landscape. Grand estates sprouted along the river like mushrooms after rain, each more ostentatious than the last. The Vandermeer mansion had stood empty for nearly a decade after old Cornelius Vannier died without heirs in 1863. Its Gothic Revival architecture and sprawling grounds a reminder of faded glory. The house itself was a monument to an earlier era of wealth with its pointed arches, elaborate stonework, and a tower that rose above the treine like a warning finger pointed at the sky. When Baron Heinrich von Strauss purchased the property in 1870 for the substantial sum of $45,000, the locals were cautiously optimistic. The Baron, a man in his late 50s with silver hair swept back from a high forehead and a meticulously groomed beard that reached nearly to his chest, claimed to be minor Austrian nobility who had made his fortune in the timber trade throughout the Tinde forests of Bohemia and Moravia. He spoke English with a thick accent that some found charming and others found effective, rolling his Rs and emphasizing unexpected syllables in a way that made even simple statements sound portentous. He was generous with the local tradesmen, paying his bills promptly and in gold coin rather than the banknotes that many distrusted in those uncertain post-war years. He paid his servants well, considerably better than the going rate, and seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of the community, attending church services at the Dutch Reformed congregation and making substantial donations to the local orphanage. But it was his passion for music that truly defined him in the eyes of Rincliffe society. The Baron had spent what locals estimated to be another $20,000 renovating the mansion's ballroom, a cavernous space on the ground floor that had once hosted the region's most elegant gatherings. He installed acoustical panels imported from Vienna, crafted from special woods that he claimed had been aged for decades to achieve perfect resonance. He brought in craftsmen from New York City to build a stage that could accommodate a small orchestra with special flooring designed to enhance the sound of footsteps and create the illusion that performers were larger than life. The ceiling was repainted, with elaborate fresco depicting scenes from classical mythology. Apollo and the Muses, Orpheus charming the beasts with his lyre, all executed by an Italian artist who spent 6 months living at the estate. The Baron hired musicians from New York City and even from as far as Boston and Philadelphia, paying them handsomely to make the journey to Rincliffe and perform for his guests. He hosted monthly performances that became the social event of the season, sending out engraved invitations on heavy cream, colored paper embossed with his family crest, a somewhat suspicious detail, as some of the older families quietly noted that the crest bore no resemblance to any known Austrian noble house. But such concerns were easily overlooked when one received an invitation to hear a string quartet from the Steve New York Philharmonic, or a pianist who had studied under Franz Liszt himself. Families would travel for hours to attend these performances dressed in their finest clothes, the women in silk gowns with bustles and the men in formal evening wear. They would arrive in carriages that lined the long drive leading up to the mansion, their horses stamping and snorting in the cool evening air. The Baron himself would greet each guest personally at the door, bowing over the ladies' hands with old-world courtesy and engaging the gentlemen in conversation about politics, business, and the arts. He was an excellent host, attentive without being obsequious, knowledgeable without being pedantic. The Baron would often introduce the performers himself, standing on the stage, with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. He would speak eloquently about the emotional power of music, about how it could transport the soul to realms beyond the mundane concerns of daily life, about how the great composers had understood something fundamental about the human condition that could not be expressed in mere words. His eyes would shine with an intensity that some found inspiring and others found unsettling, a fervor that seemed almost religious in its devotion. The performances themselves were exquisite. The musicians were of the highest caliber, and the acoustics of the renovated ballroom were indeed remarkable. Sound seemed to linger in the air, each note resonating with an almost physical presence. Attendees would later remark that the music at the Vanier Mansion felt different from anything they had experienced elsewhere, as though it reached into their chests and stirred something deep and unnameable. Many left the performances in a strange contemplative silence, speaking in hushed tones during the carriage rides home, as if afraid that loud conversation might shatter some fragile spell. It was during the winter season of 1871 that whispers first began to circulate. Several guests independently remarked upon a new element in the Baron's musical gatherings, a voice that none could quite place. During one particular performance, as a string quartet played a movement from Schubert, some listeners swore they heard a woman singing softly beneath the music. Not loudly enough to be clearly distinguished, but distinctly human, weaving through the melody like a shadow. Those seated closer to the stage reported hearing nothing of the sort, while those farther back, near the edges of the ballroom, insisted the voice was unmistakable. When asked afterward, the Baron smiled thinly and suggested that the acoustics sometimes produced curious effects, reflections and echoes that could deceive the ear. As the months passed, the reports grew more specific. The voice, guests claimed, was hauntingly beautiful, a soprano of extraordinary purity, tinged with an undercurrent of sorrow that left listeners with tears in their eyes for reasons they could not articulate. Yet no singer ever appeared on stage to accompany the musicians. When directly questioned, the Baron dismissed the matter with increasing irritation. He reminded his guests that imagination was a powerful thing, especially when stirred by fine music and candlelight. Still, some noticed that he had begun standing near the rear of the ballroom during performances, rather than at the front, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly as though listening for something only he could hear. By the summer of 1872, The invitations to the mansion had become less frequent. Monthly performances became quarterly, then sporadic. When they did occur, the guest list was noticeably smaller, restricted to a handful of trusted acquaintances and prominent figures from New York City. The servants, once cheerful and eager to speak of their employer's generosity, now avoided questions. Several resigned without explanation, forfeiting wages that would have taken months to earn elsewhere. Those who remained appeared anxious and withdrawn. The local blacksmith remarked that when the Baron's carriage came in for repairs, the driver would refuse to dismount, sitting rigidly on the bench with his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if fearful of what might happen should he step foot on the grounds. It was also during this period that the township's children began daring one another to approach the mansion at night. They told stories of lights moving behind the tall arched windows long after midnight, and of music drifting faintly through the trees when no events were scheduled. One boy claimed he heard a woman crying near the riverbank below the estate, her sobs carried on the mist rising from the water. When he followed the sound, he said, it stopped abruptly, replaced by a single sustained note, so clear and piercing that it sent him running home in terror. The Baron himself became a more elusive figure. He no longer attended church services regularly, nor did he make his customary appearances at civic functions. Letters addressed to him sometimes went unanswered. When he did appear in public, townsfolk remarked that he looked older, gaunter, his beard streaked with more white than before. His once immaculate attire seemed neglected, and there was a restlessness in his movements, a distracted air that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. One shopkeeper recalled that the Baron purchased large quantities of candles and lamp oil, far more than any household could reasonably require, and paid without comment when asked about the unusual order. In early 1873, the music stopped entirely. No invitations were sent. The mansion gates remained closed. Deliveries of food and supplies continued, but even these became irregular. The servants who ventured into town did so quickly and alone, refusing offers of conversation. A sense of unease settled over Rincliffe, an unspoken agreement that something had gone terribly wrong atop the hill overlooking the Hudson. Yet no one felt comfortable voicing their suspicions aloud. The Baron was a wealthy and powerful man, and in an era when fortunes could shape reputations as easily as they could buy silence, discretion seemed the safer course. Then, in October of that year, an early frost coated the grounds with a brittle sheen of white. One evening, as the sun dipped below the river and shadows stretched long across the valley, a single carriage was seen making its way up the mansion drive. Unlike the others that had once lined the road during grand gatherings, this carriage bore no crest and carried no passengers known to the townspeople. It arrived quietly, passed through the gates, and was not seen leaving. By morning, the gates were shut once more, and the mansion resumed its vigil of silence. The arrival of that unmarked carriage marked a turning point, though no one in Rincliffe could have known it at the time. In the weeks that followed, strange rumors multiplied. Fishermen working the Hudson before dawn spoke of hearing singing echoing across the water, a voice so clear it cut through the fog like a blade. They described it as mournful yet commanding, rising and falling with a precision that suggested formal training, rather than idle humming. One man swore the song followed him along the riverbank for nearly a mile, matching his pace until he finally fled, abandoning his nets and boat alike. Inside the mansion, life continued in a distorted, secretive rhythm. What little information later emerged came from fragmented testimonies of former servants, pieced together years afterward by those attempting to make sense of the Baron's downfall. According to these accounts, the mansion's lower floors had been largely abandoned by the beginning of 1873. The Baron spent most of his time in the renovated ballroom and the adjoining rooms, which he had further modified, in ways no one outside his household was permitted to see. Heavy drapes covered the windows, shutting out daylight entirely. Mirrors were removed or turned to face the walls. The servants were instructed to avoid the ballroom at all costs and to deliver meals to a small antechamber outside its doors, where they would knock once and retreat without waiting for acknowledgement. The servants also reported hearing rehearsals at all hours. Not merely music, but repetition. The same passage sung again and again, sometimes flawlessly, sometimes breaking off mid-phrase in what sounded like a sob or a scream. On several occasions, a servant left a tray outside the antechamber and returned hours later to find the food untouched, cold and congealed, yet the singing continuing uninterrupted from within. The Baron himself appeared only rarely, and when he did, his eyes were red-rimmed and unfocused, as though he had not slept in days. It was eventually revealed that the mysterious carriage in October had brought a young woman to the mansion, though her name was never definitively established. Some records suggest she was called Elise, others Maria, and still others offer entirely different names. What is consistent across accounts is her origin. She was said to have come from Eastern Europe, possibly Hungary or Romania, and to have been discovered by the Baron during one of his business trips years earlier. She possessed, by all descriptions, an extraordinary voice. One former servant claimed to have overheard the Baron boasting that she could sustain a note longer than any soprano he had ever heard, that her pitch was so precise it could shatter glass, that her voice alone was worth more than the mansion itself. Whether the woman came willingly to Rincliffe remains unclear. Some testimonies suggest she believed she had been invited to perform in America, promised fame and fortune. Others hint at coercion, at debts owed by her family, or contracts signed in languages she could not read. What is certain is that once she arrived at the Vanier mansion, she was never seen leaving its grounds. As winter closed in, the weather turned brutal. Heavy snowstorms isolated the estate, making travel difficult and dangerous. Deliveries ceased altogether by December, and the mansion effectively vanished from the township's daily life. Then, on the night of January 14, 1876, a storm of unusual ferocity swept through the Hudson Valley. Winds howled with such force that trees were uprooted, and the river rose dangerously close to its banks. Several buildings in Rincliffe suffered damage, and the church steeple lost its cross, which was later found half buried in snow near the graveyard. It was during this storm that the mansion finally drew attention once more. At approximately 3 in the morning, residents were awakened by a sound unlike thunder, a long resonant cry that seemed to roll across the valley. Some described it as singing, others as screaming, but all agreed it carried an unnatural power that set their teeth on edge. The sound rose, held impossibly, and then broke into silence so complete it felt as though the world itself had stopped breathing. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of devastation. A small group of townsmen, including the local constable, made their way up the hill to check on the Baron's estate. They found the gates torn from their hinges and the front doors hanging open. Snow had drifted into the grand entrance hall, and no footprints led away from the building, only inward. What they discovered inside would haunt those men for the rest of their lives. The ballroom was in ruins. The stage had collapsed, instruments lay shattered, and the elaborate frescoes had been defaced by deep cracks running across the ceiling. At the center of the room stood the Baron, or what remained of him, frozen in place near the stage. His face was twisted into an expression of awe and terror, his mouth open as if attempting to sing along. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds. It was as though he had simply ceased to live mid-performance. Of the woman, there was no trace. No body, no belongings, no indication she had ever existed, save for a single sheet of music clutched in the Baron's stiffened hand. The notes on the page were unlike any composition known at the time, filled with strange markings and intervals that defied conventional musical theory. One of the musicians present later claimed that merely looking at the score made his head ache, as though his mind rejected what his eyes perceived. The mansion was sealed soon after, and the incident quietly buried beneath layers of legal maneuvering and discreet payments to ensure silence. Official records listed the Baron's death as natural causes, and the estate was abandoned once more. Yet even today, locals insist that on certain winter nights, when the wind blows just right across the Hudson, a single clear note can still be heard rising from the ruins on the hill, lingering in the air long after its source has vanished. The note, pure and haunting, seemed to float without cause, bending around corners of the ruined mansion and carrying over the frozen river like smoke. Many who tried to approach the estate reported a sudden chill, so sharp it felt as though the air itself had been carved by ice. Dogs howled in unison, and birds fled the nearby trees. Those who dared step inside said the walls whispered, in the voice of the missing woman, sometimes soft, almost a lullaby, sometimes harsh, like a command that froze the blood. Scholars and musicians who later visited the site attempted to recreate the Baron's final composition. None succeeded. Each attempt ended in frustration or in vivid hallucinations, visions of the ballroom alive with shadows, figures dancing in impossible patterns, the voice singing notes that no human throat could produce. Some left the ruins permanently, claiming that the music had touched something deep in their minds, leaving them restless, unable to sleep, as though a piece of their soul had been taken. By the turn of the century, the mansion had earned a reputation beyond Rincliffe. Travelers came from distant states, drawn by tales of a phantom song and the vanished soprano. The local historical society collected fragments of testimonies and rumors, but the truth remained elusive. Letters from the Baron's contemporaries suggested obsession bordering on madness, yet no one could confirm the details of the woman's arrival or departure. Her origin, her identity, and the true nature of her voice became legend, interwoven with the chilling accounts of the Baron's demise. Some townsfolk swore that during the coldest nights of January, when the wind blew from the east and the river's ice creaked, the note would return. It was described as singular, yet layered, as though multiple voices emerged from one throat. Those who heard it often fell ill with nightmares or sudden melancholy, unable to explain why the sound felt both familiar and utterly alien. Over time, the mansion itself crumbled further, until only skeletal walls remained, but the music, inexplicably, persisted etched into the air, the snow, and the memories of those who dared listen. In modern times, paranormal investigators have recorded anomalous frequencies around the site, and audio engineers claim that playback devices occasionally capture fragments of the soprano's voice, but never in full, never entirely clear. The sheet of music found with the Baron remains locked in a private collection, examined only under strict conditions, as if the notes themselves hold a power too dangerous for casual study. Some believe the woman's disappearance was not physical, that she transcended human existence through her voice. Others suggest darker possibilities, that the Baron, in his obsession, unlocked a musical secret that consumed her. Whatever the truth, the legend persists. A soprano of unparalleled skill, a Baron driven mad by beauty and sound, and a note that lingers eternally in the winter wind. The mansion, the woman, and the music are gone, or perhaps not. And if you listen carefully on a winter's night, when the Hudson freezes and the world is still, you might hear her, a single note, stretching endlessly, carrying a warning, a lament, or a welcome from beyond. Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next.